The hospital's fluorescent lights buzz overhead as Margaret, now slim, wearing scrubs, her face marked by years of struggle but radiating quiet strength, holds the patient clipboard with steady hands. The man on the gurney makes her blood run cold. It's Bill, her ex-husband, broken down, skin weathered, his arrogance replaced by desperate humility. Beside him, a young doctor in a white coat reviews the chart carefully. When Bill pleads, "Doc, please help me," Margaret's chest tightens. Her son, stethoscope around his neck, looks down and asks, "Sir, do you remember me?" Bill starts crying, but he doesn't recognize Margaret standing there, watching silently, remembering everything she went through to get to this moment. Margaret stood on that dusty gravel road, watching Bill's red pickup disappear around the bend. Little Tommy, barely 7, squeezed her hand tight, his brown eyes wide with confusion. "Mama, where's Daddy going?" he whispered, voice trembling. Margaret couldn't find words, because her throat felt like closing up. Bill had left them at this old farmhouse, her grandmother's place that hadn't seen care in 20 years. Paint peeled off like old skin, and the porch sagged tired. All he'd left was 5 scrawny chickens pecking in dirt, a rusty well, and his cold words, "Figure it out, Margaret. This is your fresh start." Neighbors were talking already. Mrs. Patterson peeked through faded curtains, probably thinking, "That woman's got her work cut out, raising that boy alone." Margaret felt whispers spreading like wildfire. "She's facing such a challenge." Margaret looked at her worn shoes, feeling everything pressing down like a heavy blanket. Her clothes didn't fit right, and confidence had left long before Bill did. She felt hesitant to ask for even water. The farmhouse creaked in evening breeze, lonelier than a church on Monday. Tommy pressed closer, and Margaret knew she had to be strong for both, even when she didn't feel strong. "We're gonna be okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice shook. "We'll figure this out together." But deep down, as sun set behind rolling hills, Margaret felt more scared than ever. She knew nothing about farming, fixing wells, or making ends meet with just hope. That night, darkness settled like a thick quilt. Margaret tucked Tommy into bed. The house felt quiet except for chickens clucking and old wood settling. "Mama, I'm hungry," Tommy said softly. Margaret's heart broke. She opened cupboards one by one, finding nothing. Empty as a church on rainy day, just dust and dead bugs. She counted crumpled bills. $37. That was everything. "Mama's gonna find dinner, sweetheart," she promised. No idea how. Sitting in that creaky kitchen chair, listening to Tommy's stomach rumble, Margaret realized she needed solutions fast. Tomorrow would come ready or not. For the first time in years, Margaret got on her knees and prayed, asking the Lord for strength and wisdom. Outside, a chicken clucked softly, reminding her even small blessings could start something bigger. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. Morning came too soon, and Margaret woke to Tommy tugging at her sleeve. "Mama, my tummy hurts," he whispered, his little face pale as fresh snow. That $37 wasn't going to stretch far, no sir. Margaret counted every penny twice, knowing she had to make it last somehow. The old farmhouse felt bigger and emptier in daylight, with cobwebs hanging like lace curtains and floorboards creaking under her feet. "We're gonna figure this out, baby," she told Tommy, though her heart was beating fast as a hummingbird's wings. Margaret tried working the fields behind the house, pulling weeds and clearing brush, but Lord have mercy, it was harder than she'd imagined. Her back ached something fierce, and she found herself stopping every few minutes to catch her breath. The sun beat down merciless, and sweat dripped into her eyes like tears. "I can do this," she whispered to herself. "I have to do this." Finding work in town proved tougher than climbing a mountain. Margaret walked from store to store, her worn shoes pinching her feet, asking if anyone needed help. The answers were always the same. "Sorry, honey, nothing available right now." But Margaret wasn't going to give up, no way. She remembered those 5 chickens pecking around the yard and got an idea. Every morning she'd collect the eggs, put them in an old basket, and walk door to door through town. "Fresh eggs, farm fresh eggs," she'd call out, her voice getting stronger with each house. Mrs. Patterson was her first customer, buying a dozen for $2. "You're doing good, dear," the older woman said kindly. "Don't let nobody tell you different." Margaret walked miles every day, her feet blistering in those old shoes, but she kept going. The egg money wasn't much, but it was something. Tommy helped when he got home from school, gathering eggs and cleaning the coop. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret could see changes. Her clothes felt looser, her breathing got easier, and calluses formed on her hands from all the work. But the worry never left her mind. Would they have enough? Could she keep this up? The hardest part was watching Tommy try to be brave. He never complained about the simple meals or the patched clothes, but Margaret noticed how quiet he got when other kids talked about their weekend trips or new toys. "Mama," Tommy said one evening, sitting at their wobbly kitchen table, "Billy's mama makes pancakes every Sunday. Do you think maybe someday?" Margaret's heart squeezed tight. "Someday, sweetheart. Mama's working on it." She'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and praying for strength. "Lord, please help me provide for my boy. Show me the way." The chickens became their lifeline. Margaret learned their schedules, knew which hen laid the biggest eggs, and talked to them like old friends. "Come on, ladies," she'd say. "We're all in this together." But one Tuesday morning, everything changed. Margaret was getting ready to make her egg rounds when Tommy stumbled coming down the stairs. "Mama, I feel dizzy," he said, his voice weak. At school that afternoon, the teacher called Margaret to come quick. She found Tommy sitting in the nurse's office, pale and shaky. "He fainted during recess," the nurse explained gently. "When did he last have a proper meal?" Margaret's cheeks burned with embarrassment. We're going through a tough time right now." The nurse nodded, understanding. "I think Tommy needs to see a doctor, Mrs. Margaret. His blood sugar might be low from not eating enough." Walking home, holding Tommy's small hand, Margaret felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. A doctor visit would cost money they didn't have. Medicine would be even more. That night, after tucking Tommy into bed with an extra blanket, Margaret sat in the dark kitchen and let the tears come. How was she going to afford healthcare when she could barely afford food? Outside, the chickens clucked softly, and Margaret whispered a prayer into the darkness, asking for a miracle. Margaret couldn't afford a doctor, so she did what generations of mothers had done before her. She turned to what she knew. In the old kitchen, she boiled water and made herbal tea from mint leaves growing wild behind the house. "Drink this, sweetheart," she whispered to Tommy, helping him sit up in bed. "It'll help settle your stomach." Sleep became a stranger to Margaret. She sat in that old wooden chair beside Tommy's bed, watching his little chest rise and fall, praying his fever would break. Every few hours, she'd touch his forehead with the back of her hand, hoping to feel coolness instead of heat. The confidence she'd been building started crumbling like old brick. Doubt crept into her mind like shadows at sunset. "Am I doing enough? Am I failing him?" she asked herself over and over. Tommy tried to be brave, but Margaret could see the embarrassment in his young eyes. When kids at school talked about their weekend plans or new clothes, he'd get quiet and look down at his worn shoes. "Mama," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper, "why don't we have what other families have?" Margaret's heart ached. "Sometimes life tests us, baby, but that doesn't mean we're worth any less." 3 weeks after the fainting incident, Bill showed up unannounced. Margaret heard his truck rumbling up the dirt road and felt her stomach twist into knots. He walked into their house like he still owned the place, looking around with cold eyes. "I need to get some of my tools from the shed," he said, not even asking how they were doing. Margaret watched him move around, this man who'd once promised to love and protect them. He saw Tommy's pale face, noticed the empty pantry, but his expression never changed. No compassion, no concern, just indifference. "You look like you're managing fine," Bill said with a shrug, loading his toolbox into the truck. "Tommy's been sick," Margaret said quietly, hoping to reach some part of his heart. Bill paused for a moment, then kept walking. "Kids get sick, that's what they do." After he drove away, Margaret sat on the front porch steps and felt more alone than ever. Tommy came out and sat beside her, leaning against her arm. "I don't miss him, Mama," Tommy said softly. "I just miss having a daddy who cared." That night, after Tommy fell asleep, Margaret knelt beside her bed and prayed like her life depended on it. "Lord, I'm trying my best here. Please give me strength to keep going. Show me how to take care of my boy." The next morning brought new worry. Mrs. Henderson, Tommy's teacher, called Margaret to the school for a meeting. "I'm concerned about Tommy," she said gently, sitting across from Margaret in the small office. "He's missed several days this month and his concentration isn't what it used to be." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. "He's been feeling poorly, but he's getting better. I understand you're going through a difficult time, Mrs. Henderson continued, but if Tommy continues missing school, it could affect his grades and his future opportunities." The words hit Margaret like cold water. Everything she was doing, all the struggling and sacrifice, was to give Tommy a better life. But what if her efforts weren't enough? What if she was actually hurting his chances? Walking home that afternoon, Margaret felt the weight of impossible choices. Keep Tommy home when he's weak and risk his education, or send him to school when he's not well and risk his health. That evening, as she watched Tommy struggle with his homework at the kitchen table, Margaret made a silent promise. She would find a way to give him proper nutrition and healthcare no matter what it took. Outside, storm clouds gathered in the distance, and Margaret wondered if their hardest days were still ahead. Margaret knew she needed steady work, something more than selling eggs. She heard that Murphy's Diner in town was looking for a cook, so she put on her best dress and walked the 3 miles into town, hope beating in her chest like a bird trying to escape. The owner, Mrs. Murphy, looked Margaret up and down with sharp eyes. "Sorry, honey," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "For folks carrying extra weight, we only got hard labor jobs. Kitchen work requires being on your feet all day." Margaret's face burned with embarrassment, but she kept her chin up. "I understand, Mum. What kind of work do you have?" That's how Margaret found herself down at Miller's Creek every morning at sunrise, washing clothes for the townspeople. The water was cold as winter, and her hands turned red and raw from scrubbing. Other women worked alongside her, but they whispered and pointed when they thought she wasn't looking. "Look at her struggling with that heavy basket," one would say. "Poor thing trying to keep up with the rest of us," another would add. Margaret heard every word, but she kept scrubbing, kept working, kept pushing forward. The pay was 50 cents a basket, and she could manage 4 baskets a day if she worked from dawn to dusk. Every Tuesday, Margaret walked to Peterson's general store to buy Tommy's school supplies. She'd stand in front of the shelves, counting her coins twice, making hard choices. Tommy needed new notebooks, but that meant she'd skip lunch again. "Just the notebooks today," she'd tell Mr. Peterson, her stomach growling loud enough for him to hear. "Margaret, when's the last time you had a proper meal?" he asked kindly. "I'm fine," she'd say, but they both knew it wasn't true. Margaret started getting up before the rooster crowed, walking to the creek in darkness with her heavy basket of dirty clothes. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt, and sometimes she'd find herself crying from pure exhaustion as she walked that lonely road. But every time the tears came, she'd wipe them away and say out loud, "Tommy's going to get his education, even if I work myself to nothing." The weight was falling off her now. Not from any plan or diet, but from walking miles every day and eating once every other day. Her clothes hung loose, and neighbors started noticing the change. "Margaret's looking different," Mrs. Patterson mentioned to her husband. "All that hard work's changing her." Tommy noticed too. "Mama, you're getting skinny," he said one evening, worry in his young voice. "I'm just getting stronger, baby," Margaret replied, though she felt weaker than ever. One Thursday afternoon, after a long day at the creek, Margaret walked up the dirt road toward home, her wet hands still stinging from the cold water. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and she was looking forward to checking on her chickens and maybe finding enough eggs for Tommy's dinner. But as she got closer to the farmhouse, something felt wrong. The front door was hanging open, creaking in the evening breeze. Margaret's heart started racing as she dropped her basket and ran toward the house. Inside, everything was turned upside down, drawers pulled out, cushions thrown around, and when she ran to the backyard, her worst fears came true. The chicken coop was empty, the gate hanging open like a mouth screaming silence. "No, no, no," Margaret whispered, falling to her knees in the dirt. Those 5 chickens weren't just birds. They were her lifeline, her only steady source of income. Without them, she had nothing left to sell, nothing left to depend on. Margaret sat there in the dirt, looking at the empty coop, and felt like the world was crumbling around her. Someone had taken everything, even the hope she'd been clinging to. Tommy came running from the house, his face pale with fear. "Mama, they took everything, even our chickens." Margaret pulled her son close, both of them crying now, and wondered how much more they could possibly endure. Without the chickens, Margaret's world collapsed like a house of cards. The laundry work at the creek wasn't enough to cover their basic needs, and desperation crept in like fog on a cold morning. For the first time in her life, Margaret found herself standing outside the Methodist church on Sunday morning, waiting for folks to come out of service. Her hands trembled as she approached Mrs. Patterson. "Excuse me," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I hate to ask, but could you spare $1 or 2? Tommy needs school supplies." Mrs. Patterson's face softened with sympathy, but Margaret saw the pity in her eyes too. "Of course, dear," she said, pressing a $5 bill into Margaret's palm. Other church members started noticing Margaret standing there, and she could feel their stares burning into her back. Some walked past without making eye contact, while others whispered among themselves. Tommy waited by the church steps, his head hanging low with embarrassment. At 8 years old, he understood enough to know that asking for help meant they'd hit rock bottom. "I'm sorry, baby," Margaret whispered to him as they walked home. "This won't be forever." Margaret's health started failing from the stress and poor nutrition. Her joints ached like an old woman's, and she'd get dizzy spells that made her grab onto whatever was nearby. But she refused to quit, refused to give up on Tommy's future. Pastor Williams noticed Margaret's situation and offered her cleaning work at the church. "It's not much," he said kindly, "but it's honest work, and you can bring Tommy along after school." 3 times a week, Margaret scrubbed floors, cleaned windows, and dusted pews for $15 total. She worked while Tommy did homework in the front row, both of them grateful for the warm, quiet space. Sleep became a luxury Margaret couldn't afford. After cleaning the church, she'd walk to the creek for laundry work, then come home to tend their small vegetable garden and mend Tommy's increasingly worn clothes. Margaret ate one small meal every other day, saving every scrap for Tommy. The weight kept falling off her frame, and her reflection in the church mirrors showed a woman she barely recognized, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, but somehow stronger than before. Tommy was growing despite their hardships, but Margaret noticed how he'd shrink into himself when other kids talked about their new clothes or weekend trips. His shoes had holes that Margaret covered with cardboard, and his pants were patched in 3 places. "Mama," Tommy said one evening, "Billy invited me to his birthday party, but I told him I couldn't come." "Why not, sweetheart?" "Because I don't have a present to bring, and my clothes." He looked down at his patched shirt. Margaret's heart shattered into a million pieces, but she knelt down and looked into his eyes. "Tommy, you're worth more than any fancy clothes or expensive presents. Don't you ever forget that." The weeks turned into months, and Margaret watched her son grow taller and smarter, even as their circumstances remained desperate. Tommy's teachers commented on his intelligence and determination, giving Margaret hope that their sacrifices meant something. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, Margaret received a note that made her blood run cold. Principal Johnson wanted to see her immediately about Tommy's education. Margaret walked into the school office with her heart pounding, wearing her cleanest dress and hoping for the best but expecting the worst. "Mrs. Margaret," Principal Johnson said gently, "I need to discuss Tommy's situation. He's one of our brightest students, but there's a problem." Margaret gripped her purse handle tight. "What kind of problem?" "Tommy needs to pay for his final exam materials and graduation fees. Without payment, he won't be able to complete 4th grade with his class." The amount, $35, might as well have been $1,000. Margaret stared at the principal, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly. 2 weeks, he replied. "I'm sorry, but school board policy is clear." Walking home in the cold wind, Margaret realized she was facing the biggest test of her life. Margaret stared at that $35 demand for 2 sleepless nights, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. Then, on the 3rd morning, she knew what had to be done. The old farmhouse still had some value. Not much, but enough. Margaret walked to the county office and put the property up for sale. "Everything must go," she told the realtor, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You sure about this, ma'am?" the realtor asked. "Once it's sold, there's no going back." "My son's education comes first," Margaret replied. "Everything else is just stuff." The house sold for $800, enough to cover Tommy's school fees and maybe rent a small place in town. Margaret used every penny wisely, investing in Tommy's future like she was planting seeds for a harvest she might never see. Walking miles every day to her cleaning jobs, eating one small meal when she could afford it, Margaret's body continued changing. The excess weight melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Her clothes hung loose, her face grew thinner, but her determination burned brighter than ever. Tommy flourished in school like a flower, finally getting proper sunlight. His teachers marveled at his intelligence and work ethic. "That boy's going places," Mrs. Henderson told Margaret proudly. "He's got the makings of something special." By his senior year, Tommy had grown into a tall, serious young man with dreams bigger than their small town. When the acceptance letter came from the State University's pre-med program, Margaret cried tears of pure joy. "I got in, Mama!" Tommy shouted, running into their tiny rented room above Peterson's store. "I got a partial scholarship too." The townspeople couldn't believe the transformation they'd witnessed. "Remember when Margaret first came to town?" they'd whisper. That struggling woman disappeared and turned into someone completely different from all that hard work. Margaret caught her reflection in the store window one afternoon and stopped in shock. The woman staring back was lean, strong, with calloused hands and determined eyes. She barely recognized herself, but for the first time in years she felt genuine pride. "Lord," she whispered, "you sure work in mysterious ways." The months before Tommy's departure flew by like leaves in autumn wind. Margaret worked extra hours, saved every penny, and sewed late into the night to make sure Tommy had everything he needed for college. But as August approached, a fear crept into Margaret's heart that she tried desperately to hide. Tommy was her whole world, her reason for everything. What would happen when he left for the big city? Would he remember the woman who sacrificed everything for his dreams? "Mama, you know I'll come back, right?" Tommy said one evening, as if reading her thoughts. Margaret forced a smile. "Course you will, baby. But you go out there and become the doctor you're meant to be. Don't you worry about your old mama." 3 weeks before departure, Tommy received his full class schedule and dormitory assignment. The reality hit Margaret like cold water. He was really leaving. That night, alone in their small room, Margaret knelt beside her bed and prayed harder than she ever had. "Lord, I'm giving him to you now. Please watch over my boy when I can't." The final week arrived too quickly. Margaret helped Tommy pack his few belongings, her heart breaking a little more with each item folded into his second-hand suitcase. "What if something happens to you while I'm gone?" Tommy asked, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret took his hands in hers. "Nothing's gonna happen to me that the Lord and I can't handle together." But standing on that bus station platform, watching Tommy climb aboard the Greyhound bound for the state capital, Margaret felt like her heart was being torn right out of her chest. As the bus disappeared around the corner, Margaret stood alone on the empty platform and wondered if she'd ever see her son again. The silence in Margaret's small room above Peterson's store was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the old clock on the wall seemed to echo Tommy's absence. She'd catch herself setting 2 plates for dinner, then remember she was eating alone now. Letters from Tommy became her lifeline. Every 2 weeks, she'd find an envelope slipped under her door, and she'd read each word 3 times over, memorizing every detail of his new life. "Dear Mama," his latest letter read, "Classes are harder than I expected, but I'm keeping up. My roommate thinks I'm crazy for studying so much, but I remember what you taught me about working for what matters. I miss your cooking something fierce." Margaret smiled through tears, knowing Tommy was being gentle with the truth. She could read between the lines. He was struggling financially, probably eating 1 meal a day just like she'd taught him to survive. To support herself, Margaret learned to sew from Mrs. Patterson, who'd taken pity on her situation. "You've got steady hands," the older woman observed. "Folks always need alterations and mending." Word spread that Margaret could fix anything with needle and thread. The same people who'd whispered about her before now brought their torn dresses and loose buttons to her door. "Margaret's become quite the seamstress," they'd say with newfound respect. Who would have thought? The sewing work paid enough for rent and simple meals. Margaret's weight continued dropping as she walked everywhere and ate sparingly, saving every extra penny for Tommy's education fund. One cold February morning, Margaret heard familiar footsteps on the stairs outside her door. When she opened it, Bill stood there looking like a shadow of his former self. His clothes hung loose, his face was pale, and his hands shook slightly. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." She stepped aside to let him in, noting how he moved carefully, like someone fighting pain. "I'm sick," he admitted, sitting heavily in her only chair. "The doctors say it's serious." "I got nobody else to turn to." Margaret looked at this man who'd abandoned her and Tommy when they needed him most. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction seeing him humbled, but all she felt was sadness. "I can't give you money, Bill," she said gently. "I barely have enough for myself." "I ain't asking for money," he replied, his voice breaking. "I'm asking for forgiveness, for your prayers." Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of years of bitterness lifting from her shoulders. "I'll pray for you, Bill. That's all I can offer." After he left, Margaret knelt by her bed and prayed for the man who'd caused her so much pain, asking God to heal his body and his heart. Spring brought more letters from Tommy, each one filled with determination despite obvious hardships. "I'm working in the cafeteria for meal money," he wrote. "Some nights I fall asleep over my textbooks, but I dream about the day I'll be Dr. Thomas Patterson, helping folks who can't afford fancy doctors." Margaret treasured those letters like precious jewels, reading them whenever loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. But on a humid Tuesday in June, everything changed. Margaret came home from delivering mended clothes to find Western Union waiting at her door. "Telegram for Margaret Patterson," the young man said solemnly. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the yellow paper, her heart knowing before her eyes could focus on the words, "Tommy hospitalized, stop serious condition, stop come immediately, stop State General Hospital, stop." The telegram fluttered to the floor as Margaret's legs gave out. She sat on her doorstep, staring at those terrible words, feeling like her world was collapsing all over again. Mrs. Patterson found her there an hour later, still clutching the telegram. "What is it, dear?" she asked with concern. "It's Tommy," Margaret whispered. "He's dying, and I can't get to him." Missing someone was like a cactus. It stung every single day, but somehow you survived. But the thought of losing Tommy forever? That might finally break her. Margaret counted her money 3 times, $47 and change. Bus fare to the state capital was $32 one way. That left $15 for everything else, food, lodging, and whatever Tommy might need. "Lord, please make this enough," she whispered, stuffing her few belongings into a paper bag. The bus ride took 8 hours, and Margaret clutched that telegram like a lifeline, reading it over and over. Fear gnawed at her insides worse than hunger ever had. What if she arrived too late? What if Tommy was already gone? At the bus station in the capital, Margaret felt overwhelmed by the noise and crowds. Buildings stretched toward the sky like concrete mountains, and people rushed past without making eye contact. She'd never felt so small and lost in her life. With no money for a hotel, Margaret spent her first night on a bench in the bus station, using her thin coat as a blanket. Security guards eyed her suspiciously, but she kept her head down and tried to look invisible. Morning brought new challenges. Margaret asked directions to State General Hospital and learned it was a 2-mile walk through unfamiliar streets. Her feet, already sore from years of walking country roads, began bleeding in her worn shoes before she'd gone 6 blocks. Finding Tommy broke Margaret's heart into a million pieces. Her strong, determined son lay pale and thin in a hospital bed, connected to tubes and machines that beeped steadily. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his cheeks were hollow from weight loss. "Mama?" Tommy whispered when he saw her, tears streaming down his face. "You came." "Course I came, baby," Margaret said, taking his hand gently. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." The doctor explained that Tommy had collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. "He's been working 3 jobs while attending medical school," Dr. Stevens said quietly. "His body just gave out." Margaret stayed by Tommy's bedside for 3 days, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair and eating crackers from the vending machine. She held his hand, told him stories from home, and prayed with him when he felt strong enough. "Mama, I'm sorry," Tommy said weakly. "I wanted to make you proud, but I couldn't keep up." "You listen to me, Thomas Patterson," Margaret said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. This is just a bump in the road." To pay for extended hospital parking and Tommy's extra medications, Margaret sold her sewing services to hospital staff. She mended scrubs in the cafeteria, hemmed dresses for nurses, and cleaned office floors for extra cash. "That woman's got more grit than anyone I've seen," the head nurse commented. Sleeping in that chair every night, working all day just to stay near her boy. Slowly, Tommy began recovering. The color returned to his cheeks, and his strength came back day by day. After 2 weeks, he was discharged with strict orders to rest and eat properly. "I'm going to finish medical school, Mama," Tommy promised as they prepared for his return to dormitory life. "But I'll be smarter about taking care of myself." "You better," Margaret replied, hugging him tight. "I didn't come all this way to lose you now." 4 years later, Margaret received the invitation she'd dreamed of, Tommy's medical school graduation. She wore her best dress, still patched but clean, and cried with pride as her son walked across that stage to receive his diploma. "Dr. Thomas Patterson," the announcer called, and Margaret's heart nearly burst with joy. After graduation, Tommy surprised her with news. "Mama, I've been accepted to do my residency back home at the new county hospital. We can be together again." The bus ride home felt different this time. Margaret wasn't the desperate woman who'd left in panic 4 years ago. She was the mother of a doctor, a woman who'd fought impossible odds and won. 2 weeks after returning home, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Administrator Johnson from County General Hospital. We understand you have experience with medical environments and excellent organizational skills. Would you be interested in interviewing for our new secretary position?" Margaret stared at the phone, hardly believing what she was hearing. After all these years of struggle, was opportunity finally knocking at her door? "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd be very interested." As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that sometimes the longest, hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. Margaret looked at herself in the hospital bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the struggling, heavy-set woman who'd been abandoned at that old farmhouse years ago. In her place stood someone lean and strong, with silver-streaked hair neatly pinned back and clothes that were simple but clean and pressed. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Stevens called as she walked to her desk at County General Hospital. "The patient files for Dr. Thomas are ready for review." "Thank you, Doctor," Margaret replied with quiet confidence, settling into her chair behind the reception desk. 6 months into her job as hospital secretary, Margaret had earned respect from everyone, doctors, nurses, and patients alike. Her organizational skills were legendary, and her gentle way with frightened families made her invaluable to the hospital staff. "That woman knows this place better than some folks who've been here for years," the head nurse often said. "She's got a gift for making people feel comfortable." Tommy had settled into his residency with the same determination that had carried him through medical school. Every day, Margaret watched with pride as her son made his rounds, treating patients with the same compassion she'd taught him during their hardest times. "Dr. Patterson really cares about his patients," folks would say. "He treats the poorest farmer with the same respect he shows the town banker." Margaret knew where that compassion came from. Years of struggle had taught them both that everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances. The hospital had become more than a workplace for Margaret. It was a symbol of how far they'd traveled from those desperate days. Every morning when she walked through those clean, bright corridors, she remembered sleeping on bus station benches and wondered if she was dreaming. But life has a way of coming full circle when you least expect it. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Margaret was organizing patient files when the emergency room doors burst open. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man who looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past 5. Margaret glanced up from her paperwork, then froze. Even though he was pale and clearly very ill, she recognized that face immediately. Her hands started trembling as she watched the medical team rush him into examination room 3. "What's the patient's name?" she heard Dr. Stevens ask the paramedic. "William Patterson, age 52, came the reply. "Found unconscious at home, no next of kin listed." Margaret's heart started pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Bill, her ex-husband, the man who'd abandoned her and Tommy when they needed him most, was lying just 30 feet away, fighting for his life. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep doing her job, even though her mind was racing. When the nurse brought the admission paperwork to her desk, Margaret's hands shook as she typed Bill's information into the computer system. Tommy was in surgery and wouldn't be back for hours. Bill had no idea that his ex-wife was sitting right outside his room, or that the hospital he'd been brought to was where his own son worked as a doctor. Margaret stared at the patient file in her hands, Bill's name printed clearly at the top. The world had indeed turned, and yesterday's pain was somehow becoming tomorrow's strength, but she never imagined it would happen like this. All those years ago, Bill had looked down on her, called her worthless, and left her to figure out life on her own. Now he lay helpless in a hospital bed, while she sat in a position of respect and responsibility, and his own son, the boy he'd abandoned, might be the doctor assigned to save his life. Margaret closed the file and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the broken woman Bill had left behind. She was stronger now, and she'd face this unexpected test with the same grace that had carried her through everything else. The question was, what would she do when Bill woke up and recognized her? 2 hours later, Bill woke up confused and weak, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar hospital room. Margaret watched from her desk as Tommy finished his surgery and walked toward Bill's room, still unaware of who his next patient was. "Doctor," Bill called out weakly when Tommy entered. "Please, I need help. I don't have insurance, I don't have money, but I'm begging you." Margaret held her breath as Tommy approached the bed, reading the chart with professional calm. Even after all these years, Tommy didn't immediately recognize the man who'd abandoned him as a child. Bill had aged so much, looked so different from the strong, arrogant man who'd driven away in that pickup truck. "Mr. Patterson," Tommy said gently, "I'm Dr. Thomas. You're going to be fine. We're going to take good care of you." Margaret watched her son work with the same compassion he showed every patient, checking vital signs, asking gentle questions, explaining the treatment plan. Even when recognition finally dawned in Tommy's eyes, his professionalism never wavered. "You're that little boy," Bill whispered, his voice breaking. "Tommy?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied quietly. "I'm Dr. Thomas Patterson now." Bill's face crumpled as the full weight of the moment hit him. The son he'd abandoned had become the very person saving his life. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as shame and regret overwhelmed him. "I'm so sorry," Bill sobbed. "I'm so sorry for everything." Tommy stood silent for a moment, then spoke with quiet dignity. "What matters now is getting you healthy, Mr. Patterson. That's what we're here for." As Tommy left the room to check on other patients, Bill noticed the elegant woman behind the reception desk. Despite his weakness, something about her seemed familiar. "Nurse," he called out weakly. "Who is that pretty lady at the front desk? She looks so competent." Margaret rose from her chair and walked slowly to his bedside. Each step felt like a lifetime of transformation. When she reached him, she looked down at the broken man who'd once made her feel worthless. "I'm the one you left behind to figure things out," Margaret said softly, her voice steady and strong. "I'm the one you thought would never amount to anything. But I chose to live, Bill. I chose to grow strong." Bill's eyes widened in shock as recognition hit him like lightning. "Margaret, but you're so different." "That's what happens when you stop carrying other people's opinions of yourself," she replied with quiet grace. Bill broke down completely, crying with shame and regret. "I was wrong about everything. I was such a fool. Look what you became. Look what our son became." Margaret felt no satisfaction in his tears, only a deep sense of closure. "I hope you get well, Bill, I truly do." She turned and walked back to her desk, her head held high. Tommy appeared at her side, taking her hand in his. "I'm proud of you, Mama," he whispered, "for everything." The hospital staff who'd witnessed the exchange without understanding all the history began clapping softly. They couldn't know the full story, but they recognized the power of dignity overcoming pain, of grace triumphing over bitterness. Margaret squeezed her son's hand and smiled. After all these years, she'd finally come full circle. 3 weeks later, after Bill had recovered and left town for good, Margaret drove out to the old farmhouse property. The new owners had fixed it up nicely, but what caught her attention was the field behind it. Wildflowers bloomed everywhere, more beautiful and abundant than she'd ever seen. Purple lupins, yellow daisies, and red poppies painted the meadow like God's own artwork. Margaret stood in that field, slim and strong, her face peaceful. The woman who'd once been abandoned here with nothing but 5 chickens and a broken heart was gone. In her place stood someone who'd discovered that what has strong roots, love, determination, faith, can weather any storm. Looking up at the clear blue sky, Margaret whispered, "Thank you, Lord, it was all worth it." The wind carried her words across the blooming field, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt completely free. Margaret's story reminds us that our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest transformations. When life knocks you down, when people abandon you, when circumstances seem impossible, that's not the end of your story. That's just the beginning of discovering who you really are. Think about your own life right now. What challenges are you facing? What dreams have you given up on? Margaret started with nothing but 5 chickens and a broken heart, yet she built a life of purpose, respect, and joy. If she can do it, so can you. What's one small step you can take today toward becoming the person you're meant to be? What limiting belief about yourself are you ready to let go of? Your transformation doesn't have to wait for tomorrow. It can start right now in this very moment. Don't let anyone else define your worth or your possibilities. You have strength inside you that you haven't even discovered yet. If Margaret's story inspired you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more incredible stories of transformation and hope. And speaking of amazing transformations, make sure to click on the video appearing on your screen right now. The overweight woman mocked at the party lost 165 pounds, who laughed at her, cried when... Another powerful story that will show you just how dramatically life can change when you refuse to give up on yourself. Your best days aren't behind you, they're waiting for you to create them.